Emmett Rourke topped the ridge above Sweetgrass Creek in the last light of an October afternoon, and the first thing he felt was that he had been cheated. Not robbed, exactly. Cheated the way a man feels cheated when he pays for one thing and the world hands him another. He had ridden 4 days from Miles City with a folded bill of sale in his coat pocket and a picture in his head of what $312 bought a man at a county tax auction, and the picture was this: a dead ranch, fallen fences, a house with its windows out and its door hanging by one hinge, thistle standing shoulder high in what used to be a garden. That was what abandoned meant. That was what he had paid for, and he had been glad to pay it, because a dead ranch was still 640 acres of Montana bottomland, with water running through it, and a man with 2 good hands could raise it up again. What lay below him in the valley was not a dead ranch. His eye went first to the fence line along the creek, mended with new peeled lodgepole, the rails still pale as bone, and he told himself some neighbour might have done that much to keep his own stock out. Then the cattle moved in the lower meadow, 30 head at least, fat and curried, slick and dead calm, the way cattle get when somebody feeds them on a schedule, and no neighbour on earth did that for free. He stood in the stirrups and turned a slow half-circle, and the story got worse everywhere his gaze landed. 2 haystacks squared off behind the barn, a garden turned for winter in rows clean as writing, until it landed last on the stone chimney of the house that the Custer County clerk had sworn to him stood empty, where a thread of smoke was climbing into the cold evening air, unhurried, domestic, and impossible. Emmett sat his horse a long moment and looked at that smoke. He had spent 10 years as foreman on other men's land, saving wages in a tobacco tin, waiting for the day the country would sell him a place of his own cheap enough to reach. When the notice of the tax sale went up in the Miles City paper, he had read the words abandoned property, taxes delinquent, estate of the deceased, and he had not asked many questions, because a man who asks too many questions at a bargain talks himself out of it. The banker who ran the sale had smiled at him like a preacher at a baptism, shaken his hand with a soft, dry palm, and told him the Sowell place would make some lucky man a fine start. The clerk had stamped the papers. The gavel had come down on the courthouse steps. It was all as legal as Sunday. So the smoke was squatters. That was the only sense it made. Some drifting family had found the empty house and moved in, and now he would have the ugly chore of moving them out before snow flew, which was a poor way to begin a life somewhere. He loosened the rifle in its scabbard, not because he meant to use it, but because a man riding up on strangers liked to know where it was, and he put his horse down the switchback trail toward the yard. The nearer he came, the worse the wrongness got, because none of it looked like squatting. Squatters skim a place. They burn the corral poles for firewood and eat the seed grain and leave. Nobody skimming a placeman's fence. Nobody passing through digs potatoes and sands the cellar bins to hold them, or scrubs a porch until the boards go white, or fixes the sag out of a barn door and greases the hinges so it swings true. He rode past the corral, and 2 saddle horses and a mule lifted their heads to watch him go, all shod, all sound. A milk cow shifted in the near pen beside her calf, and the smell said the pen had been mucked that very morning. A clothesline swung between 2 posts as he passed, and beyond it somebody had split and stacked 4 cords of wood against the north wall of the house, the axe still sunk in the chopping block, its handle worn glossy from use. Everywhere he looked, the place told him the same thing, and what it told him was not trespass. It was care. 2 years of hard, patient, knowledgeable care on land the county had sworn was dead. He drew rein in the middle of the yard and called out to the house. The door opened before his voice finished crossing the yard, which meant they had watched him come down the whole face of the ridge. 3 women came out onto the porch. The first was past 60, grey hair pinned tight, and she carried a double-barreled shotgun broken open over her arm, which was somehow more unnerving than if she had pointed it at him, and she looked him over with a schoolteacher's face, the kind that had stared down 40 winters of unruly boys and found them wanting. Behind her came a thin young woman, hardly more than a girl, with her hands twisted into her apron and her eyes going from him to the barn and back again, quick as a bird. The third was small and neat and middle-aged, with ink stains on her fingers and spectacles pushed up on her forehead, and she looked at Emmett the way a woman looks at a column of figures she suspects has been added wrong. Nobody said welcome. Nobody said anything at all. Emmett kept his hands on the saddle horn where they could see them. He said his name was Rourke, that he meant no harm to anybody, and that he had a paper in his pocket that said this land was his, bought fair at the county sale 11 days ago. He said he supposed there had been some misunderstanding, and that he was willing to be reasonable about time and terms, but that they were living on a place he had paid for. The older woman closed the shotgun with a soft, well-oiled click, though she kept the muzzle at the ground. She said her name was Ada Merrick, and that the other two were Effie Barnes and Winnie Salter, and that he was welcome to water his horse at the trough, seeing as it was the horse that had carried a fool such a distance. Then she said the thing he would turn over in his mind for years afterward. She said paper was paper, mister, and land was land, and in her experience the two had never been better than passing acquainted. He asked who held the place, then, if not the county. He asked whose cattle those were, wearing a brand the clerk had told him was extinct. He asked who had mended that fence, and he watched the three of them do a thing that people do without knowing they do it. All three, in the same half-second, glanced at the barn. The barn stood 40 feet off, big and weathered grey, its new greased door shut tight. And now that he was listening for it, Emmett heard something from inside it that did not belong in any barn. A small sound, rhythmic and low. Someone in there was rocking on a creaking board, slow and steady, the way a person rocks when they are keeping something quiet. He stepped down off his horse. It was his barn, on his land, bought with 10 years of his wages, and he said so, and he started toward the door. And the three women came down off that porch and put themselves between him and the barn in a movement so smooth and practiced that he understood, with a cold feeling climbing his spine, that they had rehearsed it. Ada Merrick planted herself square in front of the door with the shotgun cradled and her chin up. The girl, Effie, spread her thin arms as if she could stop a grown man with them, and maybe she believed she could because her face had gone past fear into something flat and final. Even the small ink-stained woman took a place at the corner of the door, gripping her elbows, unmovable. They were not hiding stolen goods. Emmett had braced men over stolen goods, and it had never looked like this. Guilt shuffles and darts its eyes. These three had planted themselves like fence posts, and what was in their faces was not guilt at all. It was the oldest look in the world, older than law and older than paper. It was protection. He stopped 6 feet from the door. He said, as gently as the anger in him allowed, that he had bought this place believing it empty, that he was not a man who threw women off land in front of winter, but that he would know, here and now, who was in that barn. That was when the baby cried. The sound came thin and high through the plank wall, unmistakable, an infant working itself up out of sleep into a full complaint, and the girl Effie made a small broken sound in her throat and looked at Ada Merrick, and Ada Merrick closed her eyes for one heartbeat, the way a general closes her eyes when the line breaks. The creaking stopped. Boot heels crossed the barn floor inside, unhurried, and a bar slid back, and the big door swung open on its greased hinges without a sound at all. A woman stepped out into the last of the light with a rifle slung over her shoulder and a flat oilcloth packet held in one hand. She came 3 steps into the yard and stopped, maybe 30, weathered brown, in a man's work coat and a patched riding skirt, boots worn to the shape of stirrups, and she planted herself the way a corner post stands, set deep against any pull. A white scar cut through one eyebrow, and when her eyes found his they held the steadiness Emmett had seen before, only in men who had wintered alone in high country, a steadiness with a cost to it. She looked at him for a long moment, and the girl Effie broke from the line at the door and slipped past her into the barn, and the crying wound down against its mother's shoulder, and then the woman in the doorway said her name, Maren Sowell. Emmett heard the name and felt the ground of the world tilt a little under his boots, because he knew it. He had read it 11 days ago on a courthouse notice, estate of Maren Sowell, deceased. He had ridden past the town cemetery in Carrow Bend that very morning, and among the stones near the fence there had been a raw plank marker with that name burned into it, and a mound of earth already settling with the fall rains. The county had declared this woman drowned in the spring flood of the mussel shell. The county had held an inquest, written a notice, closed a book, buried a coffin, and sold her land for the taxes she was no longer alive to owe. Emmett had $312 of his own money, and a stamped bill of sale that all rested on the plain. Legal fact that the woman in front of him had been dead since April. She unwrapped the oilcloth while he stood there with his mouth gone dry, and she held up what was inside so the low sun caught it. Heavy paper, creased soft with handling, the seal of the United States Land Office in the corner, her father's name in copper plate, and the recorder's stamp of Custer County, Montana Territory, dated 1871. She said this was the patent deed to the Sowell homestead, and every acre proved up around it, free and clear, and that no tax had ever gone unpaid on it, and that the woman in the ground in Carrow Bend, whoever else she might be, was not Maren Sowell. Then she said she was sorry for what it had cost him, because he had the look of a man who had bought his mistake honestly, but that a man could not buy a ranch from a dead woman, and it happened the dead woman was standing on it. For a while nobody moved, the milk cow lowed at the fence. Behind Maren Sowell, inside the barn, Effie hushed her baby with a scrap of a hymn. Emmett had been angry riding in, and the anger had nowhere honest left to go, so it drained away and left him with only its weight. He said he would hear it all, from the start, if she would tell it. And she looked at Ada Merrick, and Ada Merrick nodded once. And so, as the dark came down and they moved by unspoken consent to the kitchen of the house that was and was not his, he heard it. She told it flat and plain, the way a witness tells it, not the way a woman asks for pity. In April the Musselshell had flooded, and she had been 3 days on the far range pulling bogged cattle. Her horse had come home without her, saddle turned. 2 weeks later a body had been taken from a drift down river, a woman drowned past knowing, and Lucius Thorne, president of the Cattlemen's Trust Bank in Carrow Bend, had ridden out with the coroner and sworn before the inquest that the dead woman was Maren Sowell, whom he knew well, having held her father's accounts. The recorder had entered the death. The coffin had gone into the ground quick closed, with the county paying for the plank marker, and within a month papers had begun to move. A delinquency appeared on the tax rolls against the Sowell place, 3 years of arrears that had never existed, because her father had paid every season in coin across the recorder's own counter, and taken his receipt stubs home in a tin box. The courthouse annex had suffered a small, convenient fire that summer that ate the original tax ledgers. By September the land was condemned for sale. By October it was on the block, and a stranger from Miles City had bought it for $312, which was not 1/50th of its worth, and Lucius Thorne had shaken that stranger's hand and smiled. Winnie, who still had ears in town, could even say why the banker had let a stranger carry off the prize. Thorne's own foreman had stood at that sale, meaning to buy the place back for a song, and the cash bid from Miles City had run past him, and Thorne could not raise a protest over an auction built on his own sworn inquest without drawing the kind of eyes he could least afford. So he had smiled and shaken the winner's hand, and reckoned no doubt on squeezing one unrooted newcomer off the land by spring, the way he had squeezed steadier men before. She had come home afoot near 3 weeks after the flood, having been swept, half drowned, and walked out of the breaks with a cracked rib, to find her own death notice posted, and Thorne's men already riding her fence lines with the easy proprietary slouch of men counting another man's cattle. And she had understood, standing in the dark outside her own lit windows, that if she walked into Carrow Bend alive, she would be a woman alone contradicting the sworn word of the richest man in the county, with the records burned and the recorder in Thorne's pocket. Or she would simply have an accident. Dead women who come back to life are a great inconvenience to the men who buried them. So she had done the harder thing. She had stayed dead. She had gone to ground on her own land, living in the barn loft and the line shack, working her cattle at night and in the grey edges of morning, keeping the home fires low. And she had gathered her people, because a woman cannot hold a ranch alone and invisible. Ada Merrick had taught school in Carrow Bend for 11 years, until she stood up at a town meeting and asked Lucius Thorne in public why 3 widows in a row had lost their places to his bank in 18 months, and found her teaching contract not renewed and her lodgings suddenly wanted. Effie Barnes had been married 10 months to a freighter who died under a rolled wagon, and when her baby Tessie came 7 months after the wedding, her husband's family had done their arithmetic, called her a name no woman forgives, and put her and the child out on the road with one carpet bag between them. Maren had found her walking the wagon ruts north of town in July, and had made the choice of a moment that turned into a family. Since that day it had been the standing rule of the place that when a rider showed on the ridge, Tessie went out to the barn with Maren, behind thick planks where a cry could be rocked quiet, because nothing gives a hidden household away to a stranger in the yard faster than a child, each of them cast out over some ledger of respectability that had been added up wrong, each of them taken in, and Winnie Salter, small and ink-stained and precise, had been the last and the most dangerous to shelter, because Winnie Salter was the widow of Nathaniel Salter, recorder of Custer County for 19 years, the same recorder whose office had entered Maren's death, certified the false arrears, and then, in August, been found dead at the bottom of his own stairs. Winnie said, in her dry bookkeeper's voice, that her husband had not been a brave man, and Thorne had owned his debts, and therefore his stamp, and Nathaniel had done what he was told and hated himself for it. But he had been a recorder to his bones, and a recorder's sin is also his confession, because Nathaniel Salter had kept private duplicates of everything his hand ever entered, in copybooks, in his own home, in a locked cabinet Thorne never knew existed. The true tax rolls showing the Sowell account paid in full, the doctored entries in a second, later ink, the death notice written out before the inquest had even sat, when her husband was buried and Thorne came smiling to buy her house for a kindness. Winnie had understood her stairs could be next, and she had taken the copybooks and gone to the one place in the county where the dead kept each other safe. Through the summer and fall, Maren had ridden the county by night. She had recovered her father's patent deed from where he had hidden the tin box, under the smokehouse floor, before Thorne's men ever thought to look for what they assumed was in the burned courthouse. She had sat up over Winnie's copybooks with a pen, making fair copies of every doctored page, every false entry, every date and every mismatched ink, building the case a lawyer would need. She had been waiting for the circuit judge to come through in November. She had not planned on the county selling her land out from under her first, or on a stranger with an honest face riding down the ridge with a bill of sale. Emmett sat at the scrubbed kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands, and listened to all of it, and what he felt underneath the wreck of his own plans was a slow, tidal anger of a kind he had not felt before, because it was not for himself. He had been cheated of $312. The woman across the table had been cheated of her name, her father's life work, and her own grave. He said at last that he would sleep in the bunkhouse if they would permit a dead woman's guest, and that in the morning they would reckon out what was to be done. Ada Merrick permitted herself the first smile of the evening, and said the bunkhouse had clean ticking, because in this house even the impossible was kept ready. He did not sleep much. He lay listening to the wind work the eaves and turning it all over, the deed, the ledgers, the raw plank marker over a stranger's bones, and under everything, the plain fact that his own stamped paper, the sum of 10 years of wages, was worth exactly as much as the fraud it stood on. Toward dawn he gave up and went out and forked hay to the cattle in the grey cold, because his hands thought better than his head did, and that was where he was, working another woman's herd on land he had paid for, when he heard the horses. 4 riders came down the ridge road in the hard early light. Lucius Thorne rode in front on a tall blood bay, in a town coat and a pale grey hat, and even at a distance he sat his horse like a man reviewing property. Beside him rode Sheriff Bram Odell, heavy and deliberate, with a star catching the sun, and behind them came 2 of Thorne's hired men, with the loose, bored slouch of muscle that has never yet been needed. Emmett stood the hayfork against the fence and walked into the yard, and behind him he heard the house door, and Ada Merrick's low voice carrying word, and the quick beat of the household closing up like a fist. Thorne reined in at the yard gate and smiled down at Emmett with real warmth, and it was the same smile from the courthouse steps, and Emmett understood now what it had cost everyone else in the county. Thorne said he had ridden out to see the new owner well settled, and to bring the sheriff along for a small unpleasantness, because word had reached town that vagrants had been denning up on the property through the fall. Squatter women, he said, a disgraced schoolteacher, a dead freighter's leavings with a bastard child, poor mad creatures. But the law was the law, and Mr. Rourke should not have to begin his tenure shoveling out other men's charity cases. The sheriff would move them along to the county line by noon, and the ranch would be his, swept and quiet before supper. Emmett looked up at the smooth, well-fed, reasonable face, and said the women were his guests. The smile did not falter so much as harden in place, like grease going cold in a pan. Thorne began to explain, patiently, the trouble a newcomer bought himself by sheltering the county's refuse, and it was in the middle of that sentence that the house door opened, and boots came across the porch boards, and Lucius Thorne looked past Emmett's shoulder and stopped talking. If ever in your life you have wanted to see a man meet his own sins in the morning light, stay for what came next, because the woman he buried had kept her peace a long, cold season, and she was done keeping it. Maren Sowell walked out into the middle of her own yard with the oilcloth packet under her arm, and Winnie Salter one step behind her, carrying 2 bound copybooks, and she stood in front of the tall blood bay and looked up at the man who had signed her into the ground, and she said, "Good morning, Lucius," and asked him whether the plank over her grave had come out of the bank's money or the county's. Emmett watched Thorne's face in that half-second before it caught itself, and what crossed it was worth more than any testimony, because it was recognition, entire and instant, and under the recognition, fear. Then the banker's training shut down over it like a cellar door in a wind. Thorne turned to Sheriff Adele and said, in a voice of weary sorrow, that here was the very madness he had spoken of, some drifting woman coached by the squatters to play ghost in a dead neighbour's clothes. And was it not a pitiable thing? Maren Sowell was drowned and buried, he said, identified at inquest, mourned by the whole town. God rest her, whoever this poor creature was. Claiming a dead woman's name was a crime, and the sheriff should take her in hand with the rest. Sheriff Adele had not moved. Emmett would learn in time that Bram Adele moved slower than any lawman in the territory, and stopped harder, like a beef gate. Odell looked at Maren a long moment, and said that he had shipped cattle with the Sowells for 12 seasons, and that if this woman was a ghost, ghosts had come along considerable, because the last time he saw Maren Sowell, she had a white scar through her left eyebrow, where a cinch buckle caught her in the spring gather of 79, and he was looking at it now. Then he asked her, formally, to say her piece. She said it the way she had told it at the kitchen table, flat and orderly, no tears in it, and as she talked she put the papers into the sheriff's hands one at a time. The patent deed first, her father's name, the recorder's stamp of 1871, the paper itself 15 years old to the touch, the kind of document no forger makes overnight. Then her father's receipt stubs from the tin box, season by season, taxes paid in coin across the counter, signed in Nathaniel Salter's small, exact hand. Then Winnie stepped forward and gave up her husband's copybooks, and her voice was steady though her hands were not, and she showed the sheriff the pages side by side. The true roll, Sowell account paid in full through the current year. The altered roll, 3 years of arrears entered above dates already past, in an ink that had aged differently, blacker and sitting proud of the paper, and every false entry initialed under the pressure of a debt her husband owed to the cattleman's trust. And last, written out in her husband's hand 2 full days before any inquest sat, a draft of the death notice of Maren Sowell, with a blank left where the date of the finding of the body was to go. Thorne said the books were forgeries, cooked up by a bitter widow, and that there was not a true page left in the county to try them against. And Winnie Salter looked up at him over her spectacles and asked in her dry, precise voice how he came to be so certain of that, and how a man knew, down to the page, what the annex fire had taken and what it had spared, unless the man who lit it had chosen what it fed on. The yard went very quiet. One of the hired men shifted his horse backward a step, the small, honest movement of a man deciding a wage is a wage but a rope is a rope. Sheriff Adele stood with the deed in one hand and the copybooks open across his forearm like a hymnal, and he read, slow, while the wind moved the cottonwoods along the creek and nobody breathed. Then he looked up at Thorne and said, in a voice with nothing in it at all, that these papers wanted answering, and that the answering would be done in front of the circuit judge, and that until it was done there would be no possession taken and nobody moved off this land, and that he would trouble Mr. Thorne to ride back to town with him. And Lucius Thorne broke, not loud. He leaned out of the saddle, smooth as a snake off a ledge, and snatched for the copybooks in the sheriff's hands, and got a grip on them, and wrenched, and for one instant the whole fraud hung tearing between 2 men's fists. Then Emmett Rourke crossed the ground he had already, without knowing it, decided to cross, took Thorne's wrist in both hands, broke his grip, and hauled him clean out of the saddle. The banker came down hard in the frozen mud of the yard with Emmett's knee between his shoulders, and the pale grey hat rolled away in the wind, and the tall blood bay shied and was caught by Ada Merrick of all people, who gentled it with one hand while keeping the shotgun crooked in her other arm like a sleeping child. Thorne lay pinned and shouting into the mud, and what he shouted, with the last of his breath before sense returned, was that the books were his, that no one had any right, that he would burn them himself before he let a pack of scavenging women pick over his affairs. His, he said. The word stood out in the cold air the way the false ink stood out on the page. Sheriff Adele closed the copybooks with great care and looked down at the president of the Cattlemen's Trust Bank, flattened in the yard mud of a dead woman's ranch, and remarked that in his experience a man did not lunge to destroy a forgery of somebody else's making. Then he unhooked the irons from his belt. It took a while, because Bram Odell did everything by measures. He read the deed through again, standing in the yard. He took Winnie Salter's statement there and then, writing slow in a notebook, asking her to say twice how the copybooks had been kept and where, and whether her husband had ever spoken of the entries, and she answered twice, the same both times, which is the sound truth makes. He asked Maren where she had been since April, night by night, and she told him, and Ada and Effie bore witness. He asked last, the question the whole county would be asking within a week, which was who then lay in the grave in Carrow Bend under the plank marker, and Maren said, quietly, that some poor drowned stranger did, buried fast in a closed box on Lucius Thorne's sworn word, and that when the court opened that coffin it would find whatever Thorne had needed it to hold, and she prayed the woman's own people might someday learn her true name, because being buried under a lie was a thing she would not wish on anybody, having tried it. Then Sheriff Adele hauled Lucius Thorne up out of the mud, ironed his soft dry hands in front of him, and arrested him in the hearing of every soul in the yard, for forgery of public records, for fraud upon the county, for perjury before the inquest, and for such other matters touching the burned annex and the death of Nathaniel Salter as the circuit court might see fit to examine. The hired men were told they could ride to town as witnesses or ride out of the county as fools, and they chose town, keeping their horses well apart from the man who had paid them Friday last. Thorne found his voice again halfway to the gate and began to talk about his attorneys, his friends in Helena, the ruin he would bring down on a hick sheriff and a lying widow, and the sound of it was strange, because it was the same smooth voice from the courthouse steps, but running fast now, like a wheel off its axle, spinning free of anything that could carry weight. And then the horses were gone up the ridge road, and the yard was only a yard again, cold and muddy and smelling of hay, and it was over, and nobody could quite believe the size of the quiet. Effie Barnes sat down on the porch step all at once, as if her strings were cut, with Tessie in her arms, and laughed, and then wept, and then did both together, while the baby grabbed at her chin. Winnie Salter took off her spectacles, polished them on her apron with tremendous attention, and put them back on. Ada Merrick let the shotgun's muzzles down toward the ground at last, and observed, to nobody in particular, that she had taught arithmetic for 11 years, and it was a comfort to see a sum come out even. And Maren Sowell stood in the middle of her yard with her father's deed in her 2 hands, and looked around at her fences and her haystacks and her cattle and her people, and Emmett watched her do it, and watched her, for just one moment, stop being a garrison and become a woman standing on her own land in the morning. She caught him watching. She said his knee in a man's back was steadier work than his judgment of tax sales. He said a man had to be good at something. It was not much of a joke, but Effie laughed again, wet and helpless, and the baby crowed, and something in the yard eased that had been strung tight since April. The circuit judge came through Carrow Bend the 3rd week of November and needed less than a day. With the copybooks, the receipts, the deed, Winnie's testimony, and the coroner recanting his April haste in a sweat, the court voided the tax sale as founded on fraud, struck the false death from the record, and restored the Sowell land, free and clear, to Maren Sowell, living. The county attorney bound Thorne over for trial at the county seat in the spring, and the Cattlemen's Trust closed its doors while men from Helena went through its books, and one by one other names began to surface, other widows, other convenient fires, other farms bought cheap off the courthouse steps. Emmett's $312 were ordered repaid to him by the county whose voided sale it had been, with the judge's dry sympathy, and just like that he was what he had been in the spring, a man with a tobacco tin of wages and no land under him, free to ride anywhere. He stayed to help through the first snow, because it needed doing. Then the first snow became the second. It was Maren who spoke of it, one December evening at the kitchen table, with the lamp lit and the ledger open between them, and Ada pretending very hard to knit. She said she had been dead the better part of a year, and it had taught her bookkeeping, and by her books he had put a winter of work into this place, stood between her people and Thorne's men, and pulled a fraud off its horse in her yard. and she did not propose to pay that account in gratitude, which spent poorly. She proposed to pay it in terms. A written quarter share in the herd's increase, earned in over 5 years, wages for foreman's work meanwhile, his say in the running of the range, all of it set down in ink and signed, because she had learned what ink could do when only one side held the pen. It was not charity, she said. She had no charity in her. The county had had it all. It was an offer to a partner, and he could take it or ride on with her respect either way. Emmett looked at the page she had ruled out in her strong, plain hand, and understood that he was being offered something rarer than land, which was an even footing on it. He said he had one amendment, that the milk cow hated him, and the contract ought to reflect it. And Ada Merrick snorted over her knitting, and Maren said the cow's opinion was noted and overruled, and he signed. The winter was long the way Montana winters are long, and it was the best one of his life. They fed cattle together in the iron dark before sunup, broke ice on the creek with axes, hauled hay through drifts with the mule leaning into a frozen harness. In January, a blizzard shut them in for 6 days, and the house that had been a hideout became just a house, loud with Tessie learning to shout, smelling of bread and drying wool, Ada drilling Effie in penmanship at the table because no child of this household, she said, would grow up with an ignorant mother, and Winnie keeping the ranch book so beautifully that Maren said the herd was worth more just from being written down by her. In February, in a lantern-lit lean-to at 3 a.m, Emmett and Maren pulled a backward calf together, his hands and hers on the same slick rope, and got it breathing, and sat back against the boards side by side, wrecked and steaming and grinning like fools, and he understood with no surprise at all that he was done drifting, whatever came. They talked those months, the way people talk when the work makes room for it. She told him about her father, who had proved up this land with a war wound in his hip, and never once told her a thing was not for girls, only that a thing must be done well or done over. She told him what the hidden year had cost, the nights she had lain in her own barn loft listening to strangers ride her fences, the plank marker with her name on it that she had gone once, alone, in the dark, to look at, and how a person did not entirely come back from reading her own grave. He told her about 10 years of other men's ranches and the tobacco tin, and how a man could get so set on owning a thing that he forgot the point of it, which was not the owning. It was this: the lamp, the ledger, the full house, the stock fed, and the door barred against nothing worse than weather. Word came in March that the trial was set for the last week of April at the county seat, and that Maren would be wanted to testify, and Winnie too. That evening Emmett found her on the porch in the blue cold, looking north, and he stood with her, and after a while she said the strange thing was that she had lived on the thought of that trial all through her dead year, and now that it was coming she found she wanted almost nothing from it. Thorne in a cell could not give her back her father's receipts in the tin box, or the stranger's name in the borrowed grave, or the year of her own life she had spent as a ghost on her own land. Justice, she said, was a fence, not a harvest. It kept the wolf off. It grew nothing. What grew was what they had done here all winter. Emmett said that in his experience a good fence was still worth riding out to see, and she laughed, short and real, and allowed that she would enjoy the look on his face when the foreman of the jury said the word, and in April she went, with Winnie beside her, and Lucius Thorne went to the territorial prison for 18 years. The matter of Nathaniel Salter's stairs went unproven for want of any living witness, and Winnie said she had expected no better, and that 18 years was arithmetic enough. Maren was home inside the week because, she said, the trial was the county's business, but the carving was hers, and by the lamp that evening Winnie reported, with a bookkeeper's exactness, that Maren had testified plain and flat and unshakable, that the jury had sat out less than an hour, and that the look on Thorne's face when the foreman said the word had been worth the whole cold ride, and Maren, mending harness by the stove, allowed that it had been. In May, when the creek ran loud with snowmelt and the cottonwoods came into leaf, Emmett Rourke put on his good shirt on an ordinary Tuesday, and found Maren Sowell on the porch mending a bridle, and stood in front of her, and said he had come to talk business. She said it was a poor season for business, and he said this was the poor kind, and asked leave to court her properly on her land and on her terms, at whatever pace she named, on the understanding that he was not asking to be given anything, only to be considered. She looked at him a long moment, with the bridle across her knees, and there was wry in her eye when she answered. She said he was the only man in the territory who would draft a proposal like a partnership agreement, and that it was the first such paper in 3 years she had read no fraud in, and that her terms were these: that he never once, so long as he lived, tell her a thing was not for women, and that he learn at last to milk that cow. He said the first term was easy and the second was robbery, and she said done then, and that was their courting begun, and neither of them was ever able to tell Ada afterward which of them had been laughing first. They were married the last Sunday of June, under the cottonwoods by Sweetgrass Creek, on the land that was hers free and clear and written so. The circuit preacher said the words. Ada Merrick stood up for Maren with her chin high and her eyes not entirely dry, and Winnie Salter kept charge of the ring, which was the safest place in Montana for it, and Effie carried Tessie, who yelled joyfully through the vows, and was ruled by the company to have said them best. Sheriff Bram Odell came out from town in a collar that was strangling him, and danced one measured, deliberate reel with the bride, like a beefgate swinging. There was cake from Ada's oven and cold spring water and fiddle music till the stars came out, and when the preacher wrote the marriage into his book, Maren watched the ink go down with a particular satisfaction, and said that was the first record in that county in some years that meant exactly what it said. 6 months on, in the bright cold of December, a traveller on the ridge road above Sweetgrass Creek would have looked down on a spread that answered every question at a glance. A hay sled cutting its track across the lower meadow, with 2 figures shoulder to shoulder on the seat, close to 90 head strung out feeding behind it, wearing the Sowell brand fresh registered beside a new mark, the S and the R run together, the fences running tight and pale along the creek, smoke climbing from the stone chimney, and lamplight coming on yellow in the kitchen window against the snow. Inside, a full table, Ada ruling over the arithmetic of a small girl who was walking now and into everything, Winnie entering the year's increase in a hand like engraving, Effie singing at the stove, and at the head of the table the ledger open between 2 chairs set close together, her figures and his initials, her land and their lives, everything owned outright and nothing owed to any man. In the tin box, kept under the kitchen floorboards now, lay the patent deed, her father's name above her own, and folded beside it the partnership paper and the marriage lines. Paper and land, better than passing acquainted at last, because for once every word of the paper was true. They had sold her ranch on the courthouse steps while she hid, dead, on her own land. They had buried her name under a plank and a lie, and she had walked out of her own barn with the truth in an oilcloth wrap, and taken back the land, the name, and the life, and then, in her own time, on her own terms, she had done the one thing the county never wrote down in any ledger. She had made it a home.